So you guys decide to move on from the trap to the loli. Okay, I'm not judging, just making an observation. I personally don't see anything wrong with a serial killing amalgamation of angry spirits that take the form of a little girl who eats the hearts of their victims, but I can see how that would seem a bit weird, especially for someone who isn't used to this type of shit. But hey, at least it makes for an interesting character. So, as you already know, this episode is going to focus on the Assassin of Black, aka Jack the Ripper. But before I get started, don't forget to go vote in the poll under the community section to determine which servant I cover in the next episode. It's definitely going to be Semiramis. So as always, let's start off with the assassin class in general, which typically refers to the heroic spirit of assassinations. Go figure. Just as you'd expect of any assassin, these heroes are very stealthy and excel at covert operations. But unlike the other servants who prefer to fight nobly in a fair 1v1, the assassin honestly just doesn't give a shit and will do anything no matter how sneaky to achieve their goal. But that's mostly due to the fact that in a fair 1v1, the assassin would literally get their asses kicked almost every time. And this is because normally a servant's power is determined by how glorious their legend was, and as we saw in Astolfo's episode, that legend molds the abilities and noble phantasm that that servant will have in the Holy Grail War. So because the assassin is more known for working in the shadows, the level of strength given to their abilities is nowhere near as high as the other classes. That's why hunting masters seems to be the more effective way for the assassin to win in the Holy Grail War. Now let's move on to who you're actually here to see. This cute little bottle of sunshine and knives. Now I know what you're thinking. Sam, why is she a little girl when in actuality Jack the Ripper was this top hat wearing psychopath? Well, I assure you, there's a perfectly good reason for it, and it's not because A1 Pictures just wanted to add another cute girl to the show. We already have enough of those anyway. The Assassin of Black's true name is indeed Jack the Ripper, and it is indeed based off of the legendary serial killer. But this form of Jack the Ripper embodies a completely different part of his legend. So to explain this, I'm going to give you the most common version of the legend, and then tell you the fate-altered version. It all started in the mid to late 1800s. Old Britain was in the midst of an influx of immigrants from Ireland, which made a slight overpopulation problem in certain areas of London. One of those locations happened to be the Whitechapel Church in London's East End, which quickly became overcrowded with immigrants. This resulted in less than ideal economic conditions in terms of housing and work, so the place soon developed into an area where crime was more commonplace. The persistent poverty meant that many people had to find alternative ways to make money, in which for women, prostitution was one of the more common alternatives. As if the area wasn't already bad enough with constant petty crime and public indecency, a string of murders began taking place in 1888. Of course, this would be attributed to the Jack the Ripper that we know from history. This Jack the Ripper tended to attack the prostitutes who lived around the slums of Whitechapel, and each person that was killed usually had their throat sliced and their stomach ripped open. The legend of Jack the Ripper is so well known because the cases were never solved, and although the murders appeared to be linked, the pieces were never quite put together completely to identify the killer. But for our case, this version of Jack the Ripper isn't quite as important as his victims when it comes to the Assassin of Black from Fate. The reason why I gave you the whole backstory of London rather than the story of the killer himself is because other than the fact that he liked to butcher prostitutes, nothing else is really relevant. And that's because the Fate version of the story forms a version of Jack the Ripper that embodies the victims. The Assassin of Black is a collection of wraiths that were born from the aborted children of the prostitutes from Whitechapel, which, as I mentioned before, was the impoverished area where the serial killings took place. So as prostitution became more prominent in the area, abortions became more commonplace and the would-be children were all disposed in the river. I don't know why they chose the river, but I definitely wouldn't plan on going swimming in any area near Whitechapel. But anyway, it's said that once the number of children aborted reached over 10,000, the collection of angry spirits that were never born gave shape to this. Now, since she's basically a bunch of angry kids without parents combined into one, she lacks the moral judgment that a normal human being would. Then, just as you'd expect a bunch of angry spirits to do, they go out and start killing some prostitutes. And they're able to do this until the murders were finally determined to be of supernatural cause, and she was put to rest through magical means. Now, because the identity of Jack the Ripper was never found, a new version of Jack the Ripper can be summoned every time. It really just depends on the legend that the version of Jack the Ripper is based on, which is a really cool thing because the more you learn about these servants, the more you realize how much their legend truly affects their entire character. Like, you know how in one of the more recent episodes, they couldn't remember the identity of Assassin even though they had already fought once before? Well, that's because since she's technically not a single entity, but rather a collection of spirits, her physical identity gets to remain as an eternal mystery. This skill is called Information Erasure, and all information regarding Jack, whether it's her true name or ability, is forgotten after she disappears. Which brings us to her other abilities in Noble Phantasm. Let's start with her weapons. Jack likes to carry around 6 knives, 4 of which are irregular, which we see during her interrogation, and 2 that she uses to fight with. She also has a scalpel, but in Fate Apocrypha we mainly see the 2 knives that she uses to fight with. These knives relate to her noble phantasm that's called Maria the Ripper, the Holy Mother of Dismemberment, which I believe is named after the first of the murder victims back in 1888. And this attack sort of acts like a curse which only activates under the premise of 3 conditions being met. If one of Jack's irregular knives are able to injure an enemy, the damage done can increase with each condition met, or can cause instant death if all 3 are met. So, if the target is female, the environment is misty, and it's nighttime, then knives will manifest inside the target's body and instantly dismember them from the inside. Basically, if the target and the environment match Jack the Ripper's MO back in 1888, then the outcome is replicated in the target, thus continuing the events that ended all those years ago. It's a pretty gruesome fate to meet, and that definitely could have been the outcome for Fior had it been nighttime when Jack attacked. Although, since it acts as a curse, using this noble phantasm on servants wouldn't be as effective in instantly killing them. The first and third conditions are pretty easy to meet, especially the third one considering that her noble phantasm can make any environment misty with sulfuric acid. This is called the Mist, Darkened Misty Metropolis, and it's a lantern that releases magic-infused smoke that quickly surrounds the area with poisonous gas. We've seen this used multiple times in the show, and it makes it harder for other people to keep track of Jack's location. Jack is also given a more advanced version of the Present Concealment Stalking skill that's given to every assassin class, and it's called Murderer of the Misty Night. Since Jack was a serial killer rather than an assassin, she can get 1 attack in before her presence is fully revealed, whereas in the normal version of Presence Concealment, once an attack is started, the enemy would be able to sense it. And finally, the very mental instability that causes her immoral nature also protects her from attacks that would cause mental damage. A good example would be if Shakespeare tried to do what he did to Frankenstein on Jack. It probably wouldn't work out very well. Now that's pretty much everything about Jack, but you're also probably wondering why she goes around eating the hearts of other mages. No, it's not entirely just for fun, it's because Reika, Jack's makeshift mother, isn't a mage and can't supply enough magical energy to sustain Jack's presence in the war. Also, no, Reika is not Jack's original master if you haven't figured that out by now. Reika is actually a prostitute that used to live with Jack's original master, Hyoma Sagara. Now this may be spoiler territory, but you've watched this far so you're pretty much committed already. Hyoma intended to sacrifice Reika during Jack's summoning, but the master-servant connection was given to Reika instead, so Hyoma was killed by Jack after the summoning and the command spells were transferred over to Reika. Oh, and one final thing that I almost forgot to mention, killing Jack isn't as easy as just piercing her heart. By injuring Jack, she just loses a few of her spirits that are inside of her, but she will not die until every last one of the 10,000 spirits are gone. She basically has a lot of lives. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of my Fate Apocrypha Explained series. This was actually one of the more interesting ones I've done since they twisted a real-life event into a legend that fits so perfectly with Jack's character. Jack's definitely one of the better developed characters in terms of creativity, so I hope sharing this information with you was just as enjoyable as it was for me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!